Hello, all. I am here again with my friend, the Prudentialist, and we are going to go over the OGC, the Old Glory Club. I don't know, what are we calling it? The first Old Glory Club conference, because this feels like the third Tennessee conference or the third American conference, but there has been some slight changes in ownership. So nevertheless, we're going to review it from start to finish, hopefully sequentially, and kind of give our opinions on what was achieved, what our prospects are going forward, and hopefully answer any questions people have in the chat. I know most of my conversations don't have a super chat link, but tonight they do. I'm going to do this more with conversations that I host, but yeah, thanks for joining me, Prudentialist.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Dave. I think this is the second time I've been on your channel, both times to talk about these conferences. But no, it's good to be here.
It's kind of amazing, actually, how infrequently I've spoken with you, even though like I have this consciousness of constantly being in conversation with you, sort of weirdly secondhand. And obviously we've met at least 3 times for these conferences in person. But yeah, I mean, what were your overall impressions? How do you think the conference has changed over the 3 years we've been doing it? And yeah, just generally, I'd like to get your thoughts immediately.
Sure. So, it's a little different working behind the scenes. I was the gentleman responsible for reaching out to people for speakers and being the main point of contact for
Hmm.
the speakers and so on. And so it was kind of easy that, being on the committee, it was just sort of a shoe in for who we wanted to have as returning guests, you and Stephen Carson being one of them and such.
Hmm.
But trying to figure out who could we pull was always fun. We have Pete Quinones to thank for getting Jeff Deist on, and
Yeah.
Oren and John Doyle were really easy fits. I found out how impossibly difficult it was to get a hold of Steve Saylor. He never checks his VDARE email, but he responds to Twitter DMs very quickly. So that was a fun lesson to learn. We tried reaching out to Charles Haywood, and Charles was polite enough to inform me he doesn't really travel. So I mean,
Ah,
just working behind the scenes gives you an appreciation for what our friends across the pond at Sildings and Beowulf do. So, for them doing their first 2 years, I have an immense appreciation, even more for what they've done. And I mean, as always with these things, it's always great to cut through the bullshit, where we all speak the same language. Any sort of petty drama we might have on the internet kind of fades away once there's a drink in somebody's hand and you get to speak frankly. But I mean, a lot of the conversations was a really good balance, I think, of what you would call like theory cell, abstract discussions on politics versus practicality about everything from language to the legal things. There's a great talk we'll get into about, private membership association,
mhm.
and then I guess my discussion about local government. So I thought it was a very productive discussion. It was a good balance between abstract and concrete.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, uh, I definitely felt that. That I thought it's. I feel like there was a big change from the first conference we had in 2021, and then the one we had in the summer of 2022. I felt like that was a little bit of a larger change. I feel like this one went more or less along the same lines as the first one. My only difficulty with this, well, with sort of the conference organizing is sort of the difficulty with the time, and the Sunday slots were a little bit hard. And you might notice that we're going to go through all these talks. There's one talk that we can't comment on at all because we both missed it, which is our friend Paul Fahrenheit's. And
I, I
an
missed
enormous,
I
yeah.
missed Stevens as well. So although
Oh,
I heard it opened up splendidly, because nothing gets everyone excited than watching Radlib show off his power level.
yeah. I mean, yeah, and also I think a lot of people missed mine too, including you. Which I'll go
Yeah.
over it as much as people want me to. And yeah, I think it was altogether really good. And I suppose what it got me thinking about is, how do we take this to the next level? How do we make another big stride forward the way we've been making these last few years with our organizational efforts, with our ability to host events, and with our ability to reach out to other players on the scene? And this is something that I think you can see a lot of different strengths forming. And because of that, I think that the because of that, I think there's going to be necessarily, as we grow, we're probably going to divide into multiple groups, or we're going to have sort of a circulation of different people at different events. And this will just be something that will become more diverse over time. It will be less like the same 5 people at every OGC conference. And it'll be sort of like, this year, Radlib is here. This year, Steve Saylor is here, and so on and so forth, right? And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
I think that's
I
naturally
think
going to be the way that it's going to grow.
I think you're absolutely right. And as more chapters form and as more basket weaving events happen on the side, I know that you've hosted many events in the past. So I imagine that there'll be the big annual conference, but I think, and as we emphasized at the event, that we want other people to, as the theme of the event goes, take the reins. And if you
Mhm.
want to host something in your area, if Tennessee is too far for you, or if you're on the West Coast and you want to try something, I mean, we would love to see that happen, and I think you're absolutely right. These things are going to break off. They're going to be a little more diverse in their speakership. It won't be the same,
Yeah.
top 10 e-celebs you love to talk to. I think that as we continue to grow, the pull will also get good because we were this close actually to getting both Carl Benjamin and Chris Rufo to attend if it weren't for
Ooh.
scheduling conflicts. So
Well, I mean,
uh,
that
some
eventually.
behind the scenes drama there, but yeah.
No, I mean, eventually, Carl, we will get these people. They're all kind of in our
Oh,
circle.
absolutely.
Obviously, I went to the Witton conference and spoke. I didn't spoke immediately next to Carl Benjamin, but we were hanging out discussing these things. This is all part of a process. And speaking of the West Coast, this is also something that, as I don't know if this is really a big secret, but I am moving back to the West Coast sometime by the end of the year. And the my ambition is to create a conference, or maybe a series of small conferences that might be might actually kind of take things in a different direction, in the sense that I really feel that the OGC conference has sort of a specific American bent to it. And because half my family is in Canada, I thought it might be interesting to kind of put things in perspective of a more international, right wing or dissident perspective, and kind of invite those views that sometimes are a little bit closer to the West Coast perspective on things.
Well, I mean, that would be all the more welcomed. I think that I've always viewed you as my like resident blue stater I should listen to as I live in rural flyover America because they've gotten it, both barrels, and I know it's coming for me. So I was like, well, let's see what Dave has to say about a certain policy or piece of legislation because he's already experienced it 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, that's kind of true. I mean, believe it or not, the Republican strategy of trying to appeal to the based Latino vote doesn't actually work. But I don't think anyone here needs to be reminded of that. But given that we probably will have more discussion coming at the end of this, maybe we should just kind of launch into the analysis. I probably am going to be speaking more about the first ones and the last ones, because you said you missed uh
I
Radlib's,
missed Steve's and I missed Stevens and I missed yours and everything after.
and I think there's only one after me, which was Paul Fahrenheit. So
Okay. So
unfortunately, that's going to be a mutual blind spot of ours. I certainly remember Paul Fahrenheit's speech from the first Seldings slash before OGC existed conference, and I really enjoyed that. It was very arousing and also intellectual at the same time about Francis Palkariaki, but I won't get into that. So Radlib's speech was broadly about, and it was interestingly connected to the speech that followed his directly the next morning. It was essentially about understanding North America as our native homeland, as people of European American descent and persuasion. And Radlib's main concern about this was essentially persistent persistent myths about, well, not myths exactly, but persistent exaggerations about the extent of Native American genocides and atrocities that ethnically cleansed the New World, and essentially transformed it into a European colony. And Stephen Carson's the spicy take on his talk was that this was his giant genocide apology, his giant democide apologia, right? His excuse for mass democide. But this is something that you know. Intellectually speaking, has been a major blind spot in the history of the New World, which was namely that a large number of native populations across the New World, especially in their highly concentrated regions in South America, were more or less untouched population-wise. The claims of mass genocides that were popularized throughout the basically the mid 20th century and beyond are horribly exaggerated and don't have any validity to them. There were obviously a number of massacres and misdeeds, most namely like the massacre of Wounded Knee or the Trail of Tears, which we can acknowledge. But the numbers that kind of result from an objective analysis of what actually happened create an impression that this was actually just a very, very low scale set of conflicts that did not have an enormous body count the way we would assume something like any of the totalitarian, what certainly did, the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century certainly did in their mass democides, or even, I would add, the mass democides that occurred at the tail end of the Middle Ages with people like Genghis Khan and Tamerlane and stuff like that. The colonization of the New World, from the analysis that he gave, and it was very, very compelling, was more or less simply people moving into space and renegotiating with the natives who weren't mostly using the territory, with a few relocations like the Trail of Tears, which is actually just a smash and grab. I don't remember the exact number that I had a notepad, but it somehow got misplaced before I made it home, as it always does in these trips because things are so frantic. But I don't know what the exact number was for the body count for the conquest of North America, but it was an incredibly small number compared to any of the democides again that happened either in the late Middle Ages or in the 20th century writ large. And so this is that was an interesting talk, and also the the real kind of spiritual direction of Stephen Carson's talk, and this is something that's reflected in George Bagby's talk as well, was us being able to see the North American continent as our native land, as not something that we're not sitting on occupied land, we're not sitting on land that we have no right to, any more than any European is sitting on land that they have no right to, because there are movements of peoples across Europe and wars fought between peoples in Europe. This is something, this is something that we need to kind of take ownership of. We need to feel spiritually connected to the places we live, and we need to kind of own our territory in the New World in a way that is, both righteous and also permanent. And, I think this is really an important thing to take into account, right? This is what all the land acknowledgements do, is they always fundamentally remind people that you don't own the land that you're sitting on. The government owns, like, you are guilty and you need to pay the government and give up your moral right to operate as you see fit on this land to the representatives of another people, because something ancestors did horrible crimes in vague kind of hand wavy ways. And this is very well appreciated, and again, it fit very well into the speech I think we'll talk a little bit more about, which is the George Bagby speech. I'm kind of curious though, Prude. All you have to go on is my recollection.
I thought it was really fitting because, one, I heard the joke. I heard that Stephen opened up with the phrase, "We're going to talk about genocide denial," but
yeah.
so it was really funny because I got in Friday night particularly late because I get off work at 12 in my office, and then I just booked it straight there from from where I live. And a few weeks ago, I was in Oklahoma City for a professional development BS, and my organization paid for tickets to go to the quote First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City, which is sort of this great big giant piece of land that is this museum for all of the, indigenous Indians that live here or whatever. And I went there, and it was not to, I guess, get your channel in trouble, but I was like, it was basically a Holocaust museum but for
Mhm.
Indians. And I was like, it's the same narrative. All that it was missing was the pile of moccasins. And they had this timeline of events on there, and if you go to it, it's like, well, if it's the red, it's the highlight of like Indian peoples in history, and if it's the black, it's when Whitey comes in and messes with everything. And you notice they're really selective with their timeline, like, King's Philip's War isn't in here, and notice how the Trail of Tears legislation isn't actually listing what had already happened prior to all of what had taken place, and it was
Yeah.
hammering really close to like even pushing the Canadian BS story that was blood libel against white European Catholics in Canada. And so I thought it was really fitting, because I think one of the most important things is that we don't talk about our local history enough. We are here, we've been here, we've got nowhere else to go. And I thought that it was fitting that both Bagby's speech and Peter Sears' speech that would follow carry this, this theme that this is your home, you have
Mhm.
nowhere else to go, and you should embrace it, be proud of it, you owe nothing to no one, and you should take no shit from no one. So as with all of Stephen's speeches, it's always entertaining to let Stephen pull back the power level behind the curtain, but also you get to learn something from it, which is very good.
It's also funny how people have different speech styles. Steve is very calm. I'm very frenetic.
I heard that you did a
And
stand-up bit.
oh yeah, well I did a little joke, and maybe I'll retell the joke. But uh anyway, the I'll have to ask you about your speech delivery style. But I had to say something about this. Uh the the Trail of Tears and all that stuff was actually kind of interesting because when we talk when uh is it Doctor or Mr. Carson? I feel like I should call him Miss Doctor,
I don't
but
know if he has a PhD or
it
not.
feels like he should,
I
doesn't
know
it?
you
Right?
do, since I was listening to
Don't.
I was listening to your stream at work today because I had absolutely nothing to do. But yeah, I'm not going to call you Dr. Green.
Yeah,
Don't worry.
don't dare call me Doctor Green. That sounds horrible. It's funny. My father also was a professor, and he was always Doctor, my actual last name. And I can't stand being called Doctor, my actual last name, so I won't be called Doctor Green for that reason. But it's funny. I mean, like the Trail of Tears. It's important to see this as as bad legislation and as confiscatory legislation, but something that was very much controversial at its time. It was not just a conspiracy of all white men to screw over all Native Americans universally across the continent. This was a specific confiscatory action that was part of a specific industry, a nationalized industry that wanted to move in, and it was way closer to a giant case of eminent domain than it was to something like the Mongol hordes rolling in and massacring everybody. I don't know if that makes it, well, it definitely made it less bloody than the Mongol hordes, but I don't know if that's necessarily a justification. But it definitely is a crime that feels in my mind now much more a crime of specific perverse government and corporate interests, which we should be at this stage all too familiar with. So, I mean, I guess that context is really important. The problem always for me, and this is something I constantly struggle with, is it is very difficult for me to see myself as not a nomad. My family, at least my father's side, was incredibly nomadic, and my mother's side of the family is kind of native to a state that is, it had a character and then kind of lost it over the course of a century. And so it's very hard not to feel kind of nomadic. And it's interesting to see, and maybe this kind of carries us into the George Bagby conversation. It's interesting to see the people who have such a strong connection to the land and kind of asking, what would it take to develop that, and what would that mean actually in the modern world. Do you want to, for interest of time, kind of move on to the George
Sure.
Bagby?
Yeah,
Maybe
absolutely.
you could summarize this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for those who don't know George Bagby, I highly recommend that you do find his narrations on YouTube. And he runs the publishing house Tall Men Books, where he covers a lot of Southern history. A mutual, I guess, friend or Twitter mutual of ours, Christopher Sandbach, says at any point in time in American history, there are like 5 actual Southern conservatives that are alive, and George Bagby is one of them that is alive right now. So he spoke on the constructive remembrance of the past and how modernity thinks otherwise, and that we must depart from our norms. He's sort of attacking Whig history, or this sort of Chiliastic end of history idea. We have the constructive view of history, which is typically towards the right, versus the deconstructive, and that history trumps our logic. Our progressive hermeneutics unfortunately causes us to look at things in a deconstructive lens, and that allows us to lose ties to our history and the land that we belong to.
Mhm.
And as someone who is, by the nature of my dad's military career, a rootless cosmopolitan without any anti-Semitic connotation to that term, uh, I only became furthermore radicalized to the right after I settled and got myself situated in the land where my family calls home. And parts of my history I only got to more recently learn about, which parts of the Civil War campaign my family fought in, and so on.
Mm.
And so to listen to Bagby talk about it as someone whose whole family has been there forever, since the beginning, really, of the country, he focused heavily on, of course, and I think this very Abbeville Institute style way of the Lincoln and the sort of free soiler tradition, and bringing forth a radical transformation towards the South. And that despite any kind of changes that had come to the South, despite losing the war, what had emerged from the South was this tradition of storytellers. And this is something that
Mhm.
both George Bagby and Don Livingston talk about. Is that some of the greatest Southern writers will ask you, well, why are you such great storytellers? And they'll answer quite clearly, it's because we lost the war.
Yeah.
And so he focuses, of course, as community has to exist, but that sort of community must exist through remembrance of history and looking at it positively from a constructivist lens. Because if we don't have an anti-fragile mythology about ourselves, people will always be so quick to adopt the new historiography about X issue. And I think a good example of that is how a lot of people will grab onto Curtis Yarvin's idea of American history without reading their own history themselves. And Bagby makes it very clear that you have to be a storyteller. It keeps your homeland alive. It keeps your people alive. And if you are willing to do that, you have a stronger chance of standing up to the mythologies of radical Republican race radicals of the 1860s and
Mhm.
Reconstructionism, which he claims to be the progenitor of sort of our progressive global American empire, gay race communism, whatever 3-letter acronym you want to use. But it was the first 3 speeches in a row have this very subtle undertone of homeland. I dare say blood and soil. So you actually need to understand your history. You need to understand that this is your home, as Stephen says. And then George breaks it into, from the Southern perspective, you have to have a constructive remembrance of your history, your people, and your homeland, because if not, the rest of the world will tell lies about you, and you have nothing to counter them with.
Yeah, and I'm actually kind of recollecting. I believe it was Stephen Carson who told the story of the Battle of St. Louis, in that occurred in the Revolutionary War. I think it was really, really early. It was fought with a bunch of French colonists against Indian aggressors. Very much, so far west, it's kind of hard to imagine what was actually there, but a fort, and that kind of intermingled with George Bagby's deeper meditation on the meaning of regionalism. I find George Bagby's work, every time I hear him speak, to just kind of be just so evocative and aspirational to what it means to kind of live inside of history. And I don't. It's always hard to take the lessons from him. I feel like I am being told something that I don't quite understand yet, And it's hard to apply to my life as it is, but it's nevertheless something that's profound and that I'm I'm kind of on the verge of grasping at a deeper level, but it's hard to express. It's absolutely true. I mean, in some ways, the South is the anti-West Coast. The West Coast has absolutely no memory. This is that's one thing that Stephen King got right in what was it, Shawshank Redemption. The Pacific Ocean has no memory, and I feel that quality kind of rubs off on the entire West Coast. And there is a whole history of the West Coast and the states there. My father was a great collector of California history, and obviously, there's a lot of stories that go back to the missions, and then even before. Well, not really before the missions, but very much afterwards with the coming of the American bear flaggers and all that stuff. But they're not internalized. They're not internalized in the people, and so they just kind of act as a background radiation for whatever else is going on right now. And as such, especially since the advent of Silicon Valley, it's very hard to be somebody who's from these locations. Everyone seems to be from somewhere else, even if your family's been there for generations.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that does boil back down to the Great Depression, because you did have so many people in this really big wave. I mean, there's the
Mhm.
49ers, of course, and then traders, and even before the Americans, the missions and the, sort of Mexican trade routes that are there. But I mean, in the American context, I mean, like you have the Dust Bowl, the Depression. California seems to be one of the few places where you can still find money, if not land, to live.
Yeah.
And, that's what I think about is that you have this whole there's several generations of people that have been raised on this media idea that you can go to New York or Los Angeles, because if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. And so those are the two cities where even if you are a native to the city, you've been there all your life or your family's been there since forever, it doesn't really matter because you're still from somewhere else, right? And Bagby being from a place and being from the South and living in Louisiana, I think that he himself has a really unique story to tell, because for so many of us, we are cosmopolitan in that sense, and we don't have the privilege, so to speak, to have a regional identity that is still as coherently identifiable as is the American South.
I mean, it's interesting to think what it would take to re-territorialize these highly cosmopolitan states. I have thought about this many times, and it's difficult. It's difficult, right? Because you're talking about an elite culture that has every vested interest to not re-territorialize, and it seems like it's almost a macrocosmic political problem standing in front of that. I know I'm kind of detracting from George Bagby's much more southern perspective and something that I found deeply inspirational, but I'm thinking about somebody who might not be coming from such a thick background, kind of looking out on a wasteland and trying to ask themselves, okay, what's left? Where do I start with the process of reterritorialization? How do I make this town that's lost its historical monuments and just gained strip malls into something that I can feel proud of and plant my flag in? It's a
Yeah.
hard question. Yeah,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
that's the ultimate challenge, and I think that one of the biggest things that has to be reconciled with that is that these geographic barriers, they exist, but the internet has really flattened them out. Because, and I've
Mhm.
told this story rather jokingly a few times, but like I live in a place where kids will ride their horses to like the park or to like the school or whatever, and
Mhm.
rodeos are still a very popular thing around me. But all of the kids, the Zoomers or Gen Alpha, they all talk like you would expect,
Yeah.
Zoomers and Gen Alpha. And I mean, I don't have any sort of accent either because I'm from everywhere. And because of that, it's the internet itself has done a great job at deterritorializing them from their traditions, their language, their accents, their heritage. But also are for so many people, and as Orrin McIntyre made a joke in his speech, the game all the kids love is identifying the brands. You know,
Yeah.
re-territorializing, like what's that going to be? It's going to be commercialism. It's going to be vague. It's going to be slop. And as nice as it is to step inside a, relatively vague simulacra of high trust society Bucky's, that's not That's not the Texas identity. You
I
know,
don't think
more
I've
people.
ever been into Buc-ee's. It's weird. I've seen the beavers everywhere, but I've never been into Buc-ee's.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I sort of make it a terrible tradition to always stop by anytime I go to the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex because it's like, oh, might as well stop in the Live, Laugh, Love like white people store. But it's
I thought that was
it
Cracker Barrel, but okay.
well, I know it is because the Murdoch joke, but I saw last summer, so 2023, someone had a gay pride post under like a Cracker Barrel somewhere, and I was just so heartbroken and wrenched that Bucky's has turned into my like last bastion of white identity and commercialism. But
The last
it's
implicit stand of white identity.
you know, you were talking about that whole Lauren Southern thing yesterday. I was like, wow, is the long arc of all this that Murdoch is just right about everything? And if so, that's terrifying. But
They were prophetic. I'll give them
they
that.
sure were. They sure were. But I mean, with respects to like Bagby's point, I think one of the things that can be carried over to us, and I think it ties very well with what Steven said, is that even if you live somewhere that is sort of cosmopolitan or urban, there still are regional stories and histories to go there. Like no one
Oh
ever
yeah.
stops at the historical markers on the side of the road. No one goes to their county records or historical society because if you live in a major city or if you live even in a smaller town, you had a regional poet or a regional writer who was the celebrity, Substack e-blocker of their day, who was, king of the writing sphere for his time. And odds are, I mean, their memories and their books are in libraries, but no one knows who they are. And I think that that's a good place to start.
It's so tempting to kind of skip ahead and talk about other authors, but the big challenge of basket weaving, right, is so I can tell you right now that the big problem with this, and you kind of alluded to this, the big problem of being so California is a great example. California has got tons of history for a West Coast state. It's got more history than a lot of states that are further east, like Indiana or something like that. For a West Coast state, it's got a lot of history. I'm not going to say it's Massachusetts, but it's or Georgia or something, but it has a lot of history. But the problem is being in California is that the history is overpowered. The cultural noise coming from all of its epicenters is always louder than the sort of voice that the land would have and the people would have, who have larger connections to the old ways. And furthermore, there's kind of like a feeling that by appealing to the past, you're committing some crime against the future or what's happening right now because I don't know, you're being regressive or something like that. So this is going to have to be something that we talk about. But in basket weaving, there's sort of a similar problem in that what we really want to have emerge are sort of local celebrities and local creators. We need to have people producing more content, but we need to have that content to be more focused and not just sort of everyone reads the news in 1,001 different ways. We need to have it more focused on things that are particular and local and useful to people in certain areas and regions. And the problem with the internet is that for basket weaving events, it's always dominated by the internet influencers, and I'm guilty as charged here. But people like me really need to learn how to stand back and let the other people shine and bring their own stories to the table, which is more than anything what I hope to be pursuing with some of these small banquet style things that we've been kind of trying to prototype recently.
Well, I think the biggest barrier that you talk about with the present overriding it is that progressive history or presentism in general has this dominating the past is evil because it didn't focus on like my heckin' transgender shield maidens or whatever, and in the future with like progressive fiction, and Star Trek has been like the greatest example of this, is that even the issues of today, the present progressive social hill to die on, is still the issue of this fantasy science fiction world of 400 years from now. And I get it. It's propaganda for us to consume because it's slop, and I get it. It's progressive. But it does illustrate that even in these like perceptual, conceptual worldviews of history for the future, we're still focusing about like my heckin' transgender people or whatever. And it illustrates to me that they can't escape the present. It's always now, in the past it's about the now is about the now, and the future is about the now. And that kind of ideology is death, because you can't think about the future. Why would I ever think about having kids? Because,
Mhm.
the world's going to like end due to my climate change or whatever. And it illustrates, at least to me, and I've written about this on my Substack, it's just that if you're so focused on the now, then you have no roots. You're deterritorialized and you're easily programmable. Because I mean, what illustrates progressive America 2024? Then if you go on Amazon right now, there are 5 feel good movies that you can look up that are basically biographical dramas about brands. There's a film about Flamin' Hot Cheetos. There's a film
Flaming Hot
about Air
Cheetos.
Jordans. And so it's just like that's progressive America. Is just like there's brands, there's like my race communism, and there's no deeper connection to anything that like white people built in this
And then
country.
there's a variety of science fiction scripts that are obviously written by Asian women,
Oh yeah.
as our friend Isaac likes to say. Yeah, it's I need we need to move on, but I feel you in this one. The 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 kind of cultural dead zone we are in. This is something that I had to learn, is that the past is essential for a future, because you need to know your understanding of yourself in time to desituate yourself from present thought. And we don't know the future, so you can't march in the name of the future. Your identity has to be located in the past. And if you don't have a past, people that has no past has no collective future. And other than that, you're just doing the individualism type deal. But let's move on. So the next talk, if I'm getting this correctly, I hope I didn't skip anyone, is Peter Césaire. And this was probably the most, I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is probably the most useful talk we had from sort of a practical do-it-yourself standpoint. I don't know how much I really want to rehash what he talked about, because it would be, the problem with things being useful is they tend to be a little bit dry on the rehash, because I'm not going to be able to give you the information he conveyed during this talk. But suffice to say, the idea of being able to own your own land and organize your own community as you see fit, well, it's still kind of legally curtailed through regulations. You can get around it through a variety of personal organizations and LLCs arranged just as such. And as long as you have established what you're doing and what your goals are, and learn to avoid sort of common vectors of mistakes, you can create communities for yourselves and own pieces of collective land, where you can operate more or less independent from municipalities and the control of the. Obviously, you still have to obey state laws, and you still have to obey federal regulations, but you can operate more or less independently in community with each other. And this was incredibly interesting, because it really allowed you to see the boundaries of, okay, where does the legal regulation start, where does it stop, where are its potential weak areas, and how do those weak areas interface with the limitations anthropologically we know that humans have when they're living together. Like, why do all hippie communes fail, and why do some intentional communities succeed? uh, I don't know. Do you have any comments on this talk? I'm sure you do.
Sure. So if the last 2 speeches had the subtle undertone of blood and soil, Peter Césaire's speech was blood and soil, but legally.
Yeah.
And it focused
This is how you
specifically.
get the soil legally.
This is how you get the soil. Specifically through the legal entity known as private membership associations.
Mhm.
The thing that I learned from this talk outside of PMAs was that they actually have stronger protections in the eyes of the court and the eyes of the law than religious organizations do. And he said basically this is the way to discriminate, because like, okay, say some, if, for example, some, Rastafarian, I'm trying not to use the go-to example, wants to like convert to your church and then join your religious like commune. Well, clearly you can't kick him out.
Mhm.
So he focused on this. If you want to know more, he has a website and you can find him on Twitter. But his website is called returntotheland.org. I don't know if you want to put that in chat if people are interested, but and it was
Okay.
and it was inspired by, of course, Oshalogos. But I mean, his thing is that he's done this before in other countries. He's now doing it here in the United States, and he's basically saying this is how you can have large swaths of land with people that buy into, he's doing the Irania model, but in the most effective legal way possible to discriminate here in the United States. So it
Yeah,
was dry, but it was super
it
practical and
was
probably the best thing
super.
to learn.
Yeah, exactly. If I had a book for a speech, this would be the number one thing because I would want to cross-reference it. It is a little hard to talk about. The one thing I would say is the takeaway is that the private membership organization is essentially, we decided to hide freedom of association inside these sort of strict legal definitions, such that if you jump through all of these hurdles and you made it very, very clear that you were not serving the public, you too could have freedom of association like your great 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 grandfather used to know it before the mid-century. And it's useful, I guess. This is something that on the car ride back in my carpool, I was with a bunch of younger guys, and we were just discussing about the problem with older people is they think that they can just go into, they don't think, well, I should say the problem with millennials is we just think we're boomers. We think that we can just go anywhere and forge a new life for ourselves, and we're more or less accepted wherever we go, and it's just about getting the biggest paycheck. But the problem is you need to kind of figure out what your life is going to be like as a community and build a situation around yourself that you can rely on and exist in the long term. Because if you don't have that, you're going to be paying for that anyway in one shape or form. And that will cost you, and it certainly has cost me recently, more than the additional money you're getting from your corpo job is going to give you. So the idea is to think about your life and your assets and your wealth collectively and holistically. And don't be like a boomer, which just thinks like, oh, wow, I got to take the best professional opportunity. And then the community will just be there for me, just like society will just be there for me. I don't think we're existing in that world anymore. So we have to kind of be aware of, you know, uh, building that for ourselves and living in a community amongst yourselves, amongst people you trust, close to them. This is the thing, but just one last parting shot, to repeat something that was also, I don't know if people need to be reminded of this, but when you're building a community, you also cannot just take some kind of hard ideological hammer and try to do the right-wing hippie commune. This is also something that Peter Cesare was very, very emphatic about. You have to be essentially managing the roads and the connections and providing a template for people to build their own based families, not getting everyone into some kind of longhouse to hold the wampum stick and talk about our ideological vision. That is something that is not your job as a manager of property. That is the job of a religious organization, which may or may not be present, and it might be a component of a longer running society, but it can't be your immediate concern. And if you cross the streams, you're likely going to neglect critical elements of getting the foundations properly built, while you kind of wank about various ideological mission statements and stuff like that.
Yeah, he made that very clear in his talk. I mean, again, this was all very practical. It was very much the dry kind of, you're going to a professional development thing with your chamber of commerce, and it was like, ugh. But again, you really walked away from something that was really good. And again, return to the land.org if you want to learn more.
Yes, and the yes, I put that in the chat if anyone wants to look into it. It's a good you have to be at the right point in your life, but it looked like a very good opportunity and the lessons were invaluable. So in spirit of our trading off, do you want to summarize the Todd Lewis talk?
I'll let you take this one because I stepped out for this one only
Okay.
because I had already gotten, again, because I'm part of the committee who picked the speeches. I already read his speech. I quite
Mhm.
enjoyed it. That's why he got picked.
Yes, and okay, I'll summarize it as best I could. This is actually, Todd Lewis was the first person that I podcasted with when I started my channel in early 2016. And I thought that I know all the things that Todd Lewis has to say. He really surprised me with his speech and kind of blew me away with it. Um, I'm gonna hit. So basically, it was about the cause of entropic progressivism, and as you might expect, its roots in technology. And he talked about the contrast between. He basically used as a template for understanding this kind of Uncle Ted degeneration that's brought about by technique and technology, a very Jacques Ellul kind of perspective. He brought in as a solution, and this is a concept that I know Todd's been working on for a long time. He brought in as a solution the conceptual differences that Tolkien took between how the elves conceptualized magic and how Mordor conceptualized magic. Mordor conceptualized magic as essentially a bargaining chip, a transaction with a greater entity. And in this process, the human being was fuel, was something to be exchanged and mangled to the process of obtaining power. Whereas the elfin magic, or the magic of the elf friends, was something that was cultivated, and it was cultivated through honing the human to become a better, more fulfilled human being, to build up human technologies. And if we could use human technologies, we could understand that there are human technologies that would be as different from, say, the Silicon Valley technologies as the elf magic was from the magic of Mordor. And again, I unfortunately misplaced my notes, and I'm kind of going from gut feeling here. But
Well, I've got his talk in front of me, so
oh,
I
okay,
mean,
great, great.
I can help you out if need be.
But I seem to remember the key difference essentially being in how we create spaces and environments for ourselves where these kind of fulfilling technical perspectives can be cultivated. And my real takeaway, although I don't know if this was just my own concept, was just as sort of the very successful alternative communities and religious communities in America, they've had essentially different languages. So the Orthodox Jews have Yiddish, obviously, sometimes Hebrew, depending on the context you catch them. The Amish have Pennsylvania Dutch, which I think is just a variation of German, although someone's going to correct me, right? Uh, and the more and more I thought about Todd's speech, the more and more I said, well, this cultivation of the new form is going to have to be realized linguistically more than anything else. And I want to write more about this in the coming year, about how could we create a linguistic divergence, because it reminded me of an exegesis about the Tower of Babel, how the Tower of Babel was essentially the first technocratic project. And what brings about the fall of the Tower of Babel but the divergence in language that God punishes humanity with, or maybe gives humanity with. And this exegesis, this concept of the Tower of Babel being the first technocratic project of the human race, is something that is pre-Christian in origin. It is essentially one of the main interpretations that existed about what the Tower of Babel was, even before Christ. So this is something that was sort of brought to mind by Todd Lewis's speech. But you having the talk in front of you, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it.
Sure. And so for me, I enjoyed this lovely blend of Carlyle and Tolkien. That was chef's kiss for me. It was really, I greatly
Mhm.
appreciated it. The thing that I did appreciate was the fact that that breaking point he emphasized was on not just language, but also the spiritual tradition. Because if you are an Orthodox Jew, your attempt at recreating Hebrew or your attempt at speaking Yiddish is not only just an ethnic thing, but it is also a deeply ethno religious aspect to it. And so that's a break from whatever society that you may be in, which of course has its own consequences, but that's a whole other story. And in the same way that, as I jokingly say sometimes about e speak on the right wing, it's kind of like Polari, but you're not gay. You're just trying to speak in a coded language that differentiates you from everyone else. And for him, he's arguing that you have to have a more spiritual answer, and not just in the Christian sense, but a deeply historically rooted tradition and teleology that won't have an answer in technology. technological subversion creates material living conditions that we all know is fake and gay. And any community that wants to be built has to understand you can't carte blanche accept everything. I think that there are some
Mhm.
limitations to this, personally for me, because I think in terms of political realism, because it's the same thing with like nuclear weapons. Even if I reject something, that doesn't mean my enemies are going to, and I think that that's an important thing to consider. But I think that he's very right about the elf and Mordor magic because one is to strengthen our will, and then the other one is to destroy. The question's going to be, who well, we know how Tolkien stories end, but in the real world where I live in a technocratic managerial state that has quintessentially complete surveillance over me, and if you live in places like London, God knows you're surveilled more than I am. It's going to be important to consider how do you build your traditions and how do you build any sort of cultural, ethnic, or religious community and survival when there are godlike powers that can end you. He makes a very clear thing: don't take the ring for yourself and try and run with it because then you lose what you became. Very similar to the whole, what shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world but
Mhm.
loses his soul? But I thought that he made a very good point towards the end. Is that you need to have a protective barrier for people to have breathing room from the machine and the social techniques that rule us. And that can be a variety of things. He doesn't get into it in depth in his talk. I think that he's going to have more answers for the rest of the years he works on this. For me
Mhm.
personally, that means some form of asceticism. I uninstall the Bird app from my phone every weekend. I
I
and
struggle with that. That's the Bird app is my main drug addiction right now, and I love it and hate it.
I love it to death, don't get me wrong, but I try really hard. If I tweet on the weekend, it's because I'm in front of my desktop, and it's not because I'm on my phone. And that's done a lot of good for me to sort of decompress my mind. I have the Sabbath and I have the Lord's Day off from Twitter.
Mhm.
But I think that for society writ large, we're not all going to be able to uninstall our phones, or our jobs aren't going to let us do so. We have to come up with traditions that strengthen ourselves, as a community, but also as an individual. Which means you can't just take the new toy and have a good time with it. You have to find and seriously ask yourself in a manner of self-discipline, is this going to be a gimmick that I play with for 5 minutes, or is this going to be something I become addicted to and it's going to be a real problem?
Yeah, this is going to be a struggle. I think that people have to deal with addiction collectively. And if you can find a healthy way to use Twitter, then please share it with me because I feel like this is also particularly a bad thing as a parent is you always get your free time in little like 5-10 minute chunks, right? And for that reason, the phone is so tempting to keep around you, especially on weekends, right? And so there's got to be some appropriate boundaries I can erect around this thing. But I don't know if that's really in the scope of something we should be exploring right now. So I will move on. That was a really excellent talk, though. Okay, Jeff Deist. Did you want to take this one, Prude?
Sure, absolutely. So Jeff Deist, former chairman with Ron Paul and former president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. We have to thank Pete Quinones for getting this one for us. I thought
Excellent
it
speaker,
was
yeah.
a great speech, great talk. Jeff knows what time it is, and his speech sort of reflects that. Also, I really liked at the beginning of this, he acknowledged Pete, but he had said a really good thing that made me just respect the man all the more. Was he said throughout the years, and especially as Pete stopped being a libertarian, has sort of gone to where he is now politically. He says, I've always had people email me or text me saying, like, did you see what Pete said? And Jeff would say, well, I know they're trying to get a rise out of me. So I would always say, yes, Pete's a friend. And that was it. That was the
Mhm.
only thing he would ever say to these people. And I thought that was so good. You don't have to disavow your friends. You should just simply say, yes, he's a friend or she's a friend or whatever. I thought that was perfect. So his talk was primarily about defending a Western vernacular, the war for words. And this was about a paper he wrote in 2022 in the Journal of Ethics and Politics. You can go look it up. And it's about language as a social institution. And there was a great quote from a bishop in Spain, um, Antonio de Nebrija, the bishop of Avila in 1492 in Spain. Language is the perfect instrument of empire, end quote. And so he was talking about societal institutions and social techniques. Language just like the marketplace is open to corruption and capture. There's top-down corruption versus bottom-up evolution. And he references Orwell's 1946 essay about meaningless words, language that is subverting our language to pollute them and pervert them. And so he's talked about, these sort of lexicons. We have like the trans lexicon, the race lexicon, the politics lexicon, and how progressives will politicize everything and then just say, well, that's just being a good person. While, it's not political. It's not political. Putting your pronouns in your bio, that's not political. It's just being a good person. So, he was talking about effective word craft, always use the original definition of language. There is no such thing as a neutral space. Never give up grounds, and always speak proper English vernacular. You basically, he was like, you're a white guy, speak like it. I think about the Twitter interactions of like, oh, someone's talking like, Sephiroth over here from Final Fantasy. It's like, yeah, you should, like you should sound like that person. So don't ever fall back on previous progressive platitudes to sound edgy. Use the original word. Don't play the pronoun game. Unless you have to with respect to work and not getting fired, I get that, or with YouTube, but do everything that you can do to protect the language around you, because language is always the mechanism of control. AIDS wasn't AIDS at one point. It was gay cancer. If you want to go back to that, so be it. He made a great joke about how George W. Bush was this evil warmonger, and now everyone loves it when he wraps his arms around Michelle Obama's exceedingly wide shoulders. It was a great talk. It was a great lecture, and I would highly recommend people look up his paper. It was very good.
Yeah, it was a very good sort of, it was something that I think that it was a fundamental kind of talk. It was a reminder of the kind of stuff that we talk about and put in a very succinct, well said way. I, kind of coming off Todd's speech, was thinking maybe we should try to develop our own language to speak amongst ourselves. I mean, have you ever noticed that there is no progressive word for the numinous, but in proper dissident speech, there should be many words for the numinous or the various things that we want to achieve. And I don't know. I'm kind of a person who's struck by the incredible inexpressiveness of modern language, and modern corporate language in particular.
Well, I think that is the challenge, and I joked about it earlier about sort of right-wing polari, but I think that these words do happen organically. I mean, a good example of this came from a group chat I was in like a year or so ago. Someone said that the word appreciator is a right-wing coded word. So if you say like, "Oh, I'm like an animal appreciator," or "I'm like a hiking appreciator," you can kind of already tell that guy's on right-wing Twitter somewhere, even tangentially.
Actually, I kind of disagree with this, Prude. I mean, this is one of the great. Now you reminded me of one of my thoughts when hearing this talk. One of the reasons why I know that we didn't completely lose the last 4 years of political discourse with BreadTube, as I know watching.
Tell me more, Don Quixote. Tell me more.
No, but BreadTube uses old right-wing meme language. Like, they call people based and cringe. Based makes no sense for the left to use, but they still use it. All of the language the left uses in its memes are 100% hand-me-downs from the right wing. They're all our old stuff. So, I mean, this is kind of gives you an understanding.
They should go back to Tumblr then, because that's where all the new language still gets built today. Because this speech has been inspired me, because he's talked about this whole, well, a lot of the stuff is top-down corruption. And I was like, Jeff, I don't know if that model is appropriate, because so much of the language that progressives use in actual, for instance, Kamala Harris is in charge of this like national strategy on gender. And if you look it up and you read it, you would look at it and say, this is some weird scum manifesto fantasy that was written by a Tumblr demisexual in like 2012. And then you look it up and like, lo and behold, some of this language does come from like sexual roleplay forums in 2012 on Tumblr.
Yeah.
And it sort of raises an interesting question about sort of like, well, how much of this, useless words or perverse language is actually top down? Because there is, I think the biggest thing about language, and because the left uses this too, our old right-wing vernacular is that because, and I'm sort of cribbing from McLuhan's Gutenberg galaxy thesis, is that when the internet was like old YouTube, broadcast yourself, express yourself, you can do anything. it was a lot easier to propagate these transgressive, edgy, antinomian positions and allow those to sort of be found from the bottom and picked up by people on top because they were loud, they were vocal, and they were against the system. And when your ideology is basically "fuck you, dad," I mean, it's really easy for that to kind of reach the annals of power. Whereas conversations about Plato or Aristotle or Nick Land, that's not sexy to these people that want to wield power over you. And so I think that it's important to look at that, because you are right. Like, they do use our old language, but they're also, disgusting, immunodeficient commies. So I don't really care.
Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, I think what I guess what uses it if bread tube
True.
uses our
True.
language, but it shows you that and memes are more language than they are art. What it shows you is that there is an expressiveness in right-wing language that does not exist in left-wing language. Modern left-wing language exists to destroy meaning and to essentially reduce its scope of language. The right-wing lexicon exists to expand it. And so, someone said like grooming would be a good example. I mean, grooming is a great, like, the left constantly wants to accuse like Matt Walsh of grooming. But it doesn't really work because it creates a conceptual category in the mind of inappropriate exposure to sex of a minor, which is in the month of June something that progressives just don't want people to think about. And this is something that you kind of learn, is that evil can't really wield a richness of language. And so my great hope in light of Jeff Deist's speech is that by creating a more conceptual or more expressive framework for understanding and appreciating the universe, we can create kind of our own way of speaking that is both something that's not transparent to the left, meaning that it kind of ensures the privacy of our own thoughts, but also is a place where the subversion and corrosive nature of the left is harder to reach us because their own ideas don't translate well into it.
Oh, I think we already do, actually. So, for instance, yesterday you were talking about aspirational, things
Mhm.
that we use on the internet. When you look at someone's profile picture on someone on the right on Twitter, their profile picture is a representation of aspiration, which I don't know what that means for me. But with respect to like the buff guy or the statue or a picture of old culture, it's an aspiration of what they want and what they wish to accomplish. Whereas what left wing profile pictures are, like Vaush or some communist Stalinist furry on Twitter or whatever, it's actually how they view themselves. So
Yeah,
we
they're
already we
always kind of like weird Cal Arts cartoons of themselves.
Yes. So I think that we already innately have totally different ways in which we communicate. We communicate aspirationally. We communicate by proof of life, history, and concepts, whereas they exist, how they view themselves, infantilized, parasitical. I think that divergence has already happened decades ago.
I think it still needs to go further, but
I
this is a note of
wholeheartedly
hope.
agree.
Yeah. I mean, there should be concepts that just are beyond the understanding of the left that the right talks about frequently. The idea, for instance, the numinous is something that I kind of want to mainstream as something that just people understand to be a common quality we aspire to. Numinous is, for those who don't know, it's just an expression. I don't even know if it has older origins. It was used throughout the 20th century to indicate a feeling of holiness and greater spiritual reality that lies behind our reality, but it is not quite perceivable. And it's the feeling of numinous that inhabits great works of poetry and successful uh, fantasy and stuff like that. And it's something that I hope I want to call a concept I hope we continue to cultivate in coming years. But anyway, moving on to Charlemagne. This is hard because I came in late for this one. Uh, I'll do my best to summarize, but also if you could help me here too, because I came in like I think 50 minutes late for this one, unfortunately, because I had to deal with some family business. Charlemagne's talk was largely about elite theory and about the application and about the usefulness of exploring democratic politics and getting our ideas situated and institution level. Can you maybe give some context here, Prude?
Sure. So this was focused on the Anglo-American and specifically Anglo legal tradition. This was the talk's title was "Separation of Powers, the Constitution, and Elite Theory,"
Ah,
and so this was about the history and the historical jurisprudence of um, separation of powers and judicial review. Sir Edward Coke, the independence of the judiciary. We talk about Pareto and Mosca a lot with respects to um, what is a state of exception, what is a political formula, and then, of course, looking towards the historical understanding of what tyranny and states of exception are in the lens of that Anglo-American tradition. Because a lot of us, basically, we throw a lot of the baby out with the bathwater when we talk about our founding or we talk about liberalism. But the Anglo-American legal tradition was not stupid. We are ideological because even we ourselves on the right, we apply presentism, we take our base right wing ideas and we apply it to those filthy libtards of the past. But actually, our forebears were probably a lot smarter than us, and they
mhm.
probably thought about this, and we don't read about it. And so we take a look at bureaucracy is actually seen as tyranny. The arbitrary law of Congress not doing their job and letting the courts essentially legislate is actually an old Anglo-American concept that would be deprivation of liberty of free men, and that the Constitution, despite us saying that it's dead, the United States government is still arranged by it. We don't follow the spirit of the law. We are very much like the ancient Hebrews that Jesus and all the prophets and God Himself had rebuked, and that the English concept of the Constitution was accountability against meaningless bureaucratic absolutism. And unfortunately, we're ruled by bureaucratic absolutism. And, he wants to preserve what was there, not just a theoretical place, but also recognizes that, we have some limits to what we can do within the law, as does the regime for the time being, and that we should be taking advantage of that as new social, technological, and ethnic forces continue to strain the system.
Yeah, I think it was a really good speech, and it got me kind of thinking about all of the previous concepts in a more sort of Italian elite school kind of framework, I guess. Right? I guess I didn't. The threat of the division of powers is something that I've been thinking about, but I really don't know how to practically apply that in the modern world, and so I felt like that was kind of challenging.
Yeah, I mean, that was the difficulty. I thought about this because it was a great history discussion, and it reminded me of all my constitutional law courses when I was, in my undergrad. But I just couldn't help but think to myself that unless we're talking to lawyers or unless we're talking to, people who can game out a good strategy on a certain issue, it's really difficult. And I mean, Charlemagne was hitting on the same points that the former senator, um, Ben Sass of Nebraska said during the Brett Kavanaugh hearing. He says that Congress hasn't done its job for decades. It passes shell pieces of legislation
Yeah.
to bureaucracies. And so the last area, the politics of last resort for the United States is the judiciary. And that's the great crisis of America is that we're reliant on 9 unelected officials and countless hundreds of thousands of people who are impacted or work in bureaucracy to determine the lives of 300 plus million people. And that functionally does not work. And he's pointing out that your intellectual forebears, i.e., your kinsmen, your ancestors, knew that this was evil and awful, and that you should recognize that too for what it was and not look back on your, American founding fathers with such vitriol.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something that I thought of when I gave the speech. Obviously, so the big thing that happened this last year was the predictable fall of Roe v. Wade and the amazing backlash that happened from it. Now, I've been somebody who's obviously I'm pro-life because I'm Catholic, but I've been sort of a critic of centering the sights always on Roe v. Wade from my time being interested in this movement. But one kind of utility of the fall of Roe v. Wade is now all of a sudden the left has to hard countersignal judicial power and create local avenues for us to get around it. And there's a possibility that we could use the framework they open up to attack the Roe v. Wade, or I should say legislation essentially in reaction to the downfall of Roe v. Wade. Their actions to kind of end run around that could open up avenues for us to escape the managerial state at a more broad level.
And that was the kind of thing that Sam Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas wrote about in their concurring opinions when overturning Roe v. Wade. Was there are a lot more things we could go after with this? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So yeah, there's potential with it. But it was a good history lesson on Anglo American jurisprudence.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. And very another one of those speeches that's very useful but harder to talk about. But I'm very much enjoyed it, and I had a number of ideas that came to me when I was listening to it. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to John Doyle. All right, John Doyle. So this was a speech that was by far the biggest crowd pleaser of the night because John Doyle knows how to give a funny speech in a way that puts me to shame. And he's a very talented Zoomer. I was glad to meet him for once, and he's an older Zoomer. He's almost a younger millennial, to be quite honest. But he had a very funny speech, and what was really funny is it was basically just what's at stake. The subject of the speech was what's at stake in uh, the current election in 2024 that we're not really talking about because it's not a real election. It's just a bureaucratic toss up. Uh, but his so ostensibly it was about what's at stake at the upcoming election, but really it was about just the horrible state of the Republican Party and how the people who make up the opposition in this country are just utter fools. They've been farmed out of people who are kind of the second sons of elite families and who have no real belief or ambition beyond just doing boomer stuff and kind of cashing in on their roles as lobbyists. And there's an opportunity here for something new to come about. And this is kind of complemented by a variety of stories about the Washington, D.C. set that kind of had me splitting my sides. Do you want to add anything to that, Prudentialist?
Yeah, I mean, he did speak on the boomers a lot, and I know that it's easy to hate them, but also that every year we lose 2.5 million baby boomers. They die, but they also make up the majority of the white electorate, which means this
Mm,
kind of really is your sort of last election with a majority white electorate. With that respect, also he was good at criticizing Trump. I mean, the Platinum Plan, and him and Pedro Gonzalez pointed this out. I mean, it was wealth distribution to getting the black vote, which obviously will never really work. You need to kind of focus on whites, and this is something that's aware of. I mean, he was basically saying, as awful as things are, the highest level of support for mass deportations for both parties is at an all-time highest. Charlie Kirk, of all people, is saying things that Patrick Casey would have griped him for 8, 9 years ago. And he was basically describing like even your American forebears, again, like John Jay in Federalist, I think 2 or 1, basically just saying like we're all common people with a common language, with a common ethnic religious heritage. Basically, what would have made him sound like an American Wignat, right?
yeah.
We can deport 40 million illegals. So these are capital questions. The stakes are incredibly high, and I mean he made it very clear that he's been in this game since he was 18 years old. I don't know his exact age now. I think he's very similar to my age or close to it. I'm 28. I think he's the same age or a little younger.
I think it might be younger,
Okay, yeah,
but
probably younger than me. I don't know when he was born, but still, he was, it was very funny. Also, he wrote this like last minute because it was like 15 minutes before he was supposed to go on stage, and he's like, "I'm here. I just printed it out at the front desk." And so, I mean, excellent delivery on his part. He's very much a master stage showman type
yeah,
too.
he
But
is. He is.
he just made a point. It's just like, listen, I've been to a lot of these parties with TPUSA and CPAC. These people are unserious, failed theater kids that want to do coke and blow and all sorts of awful things and touch people inappropriately. The future is with you guys, which felt very, pat on my own back, but also, yeah, we know because you're talking about Mike Cernovich. We all know that Mike Cernovich wrote an article about blowing a transgender person in 2013. Like, we get it, like we understand that we're working with terrible, terrible people. But I mean, he made it a very good point throughout his humorous, asides that you know despite the fact that we all, and I know that you have a video about why you don't vote, but you can ignore politics, but politics doesn't ignore you. And
Mhm.
voting is the lowest effort energy thing that you can do, because anyone who's done any political organizing on any issue, whether it's environmentalism or saving a building or a monument, like I've, tried and failed in some parts of my life, then you know that that takes way more effort than just going up to your polling station and voting. So he made the stakes very clear to an audience that typically just doesn't care about democracy.
Yeah, yeah, and, look, I mean, that I always said that "don't vote" video was sort of my worst video of my old distributist edited videos, but it you know, look, I mean, the 2024 election probably is, I mean, the die is cast, right? Either there's going to be a surge in favor of Trump that is so high that it can't be fortified against, in which case we'll get another roll of dice at power. But there's a high probability that the surge isn't going to be high enough to overcome the fortification, and we end up back on the path we are. We have to be prepared for both eventualities, so we can't get bent out of shape with this stuff. We just have to kind of roll with the punches. And if we miss the window on holding back the last vestiges of white America when the boomers die out, we're going to have to come up with the reality of living as a dissident in those new circumstances. And I don't think that they're going to be as favorable to the regime as the regime currently thinks. And I think that there's a role for voting, but I really think it should be something that be more habitual and organized. The idea of automated voting is something that in personal conversations I really harped on this year, and I really, really want to see something like the Old Glory Club take that on. I should be told by organizations exactly who I'm voting for when I vote for a dog catcher, because that's what really matters. What really matters is being a block.
I
And,
do
and
agree
but
with
yeah,
that.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I said I do agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, it what I took from John Doyle's speech is the picture of the people we're trying to replace. That was the most important thing. And that was encouraging and also incredibly scary, that we're essentially being run by senile boomers and these horrible fail sons who are trying to pretend like they're going to be the next senile boomers who are going to catch in on the upswing of American power. And none of that's going to happen. And in the meantime, legitimate issues about where our country is going are just completely tossed by the wayside.
Yeah, and I think that that will be the future going forward. Is just that the big thing I took from all these talks was just that there is these speeches gave a pretty good mental map in my brain of this is where we can take things. This is where like the OGC can step up with like mutual aid, and then we can start doing like other chapters could do like private membership agreements. And now we have these little white fortresses, as the term goes, about how to sort of defend ourselves the best way we can as this regime gets increasingly antagonistic towards the former majority population of the country.
That's really what Peter should have called his talk, How to Make Your Own White Fortress. Uh, a missed opportunity, but I think his more sober approach was very much appreciated. All right, Prue, do you want to comment on the OGC panel just to let people know what happened was we did sort of a circulation of all the various people in the Old Glory Club talking about their own individual things. This went through about 16 people almost. And
A little bit, yeah.
I don't know if we really need to rehash all of the various things that we talked about because it was kind of inside baseball. Suffice to
Uh,
say that the Old Glory Club is creating new chapters and is
yeah.
looking for. Oh, well, do you want to say something though? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, all I was going to say was is that we sort of introduced ourselves at the Sildings conference last year in sort of a corporate takeover style way, but we showed off who we were. We talked about the growth. We had 3 chapters in different parts of the country. New England, we had one in the uh, and we're actually the newest one we just found it actually happened earlier after the conference in Florida, so that's happening. But one in New England, one in Virginia, and then one in the South. And so places where guys have gotten together, hosted conferences, have done gravesite cleanup for things like Veterans Memorial Day thing. Also, just for you to have other people to talk to that you speak the
Mhm.
same language. I mean, one of the biggest problems that we have, of course, and you and I, Dave, have talked about it constantly, is atomization.
Yeah.
We want the third place to come back. The third place will come back when you have friends that agree with you on things that, are cool. This is the place to do it. But also that, these formal chapters that are established are ways in which we can work with you about what we need. And the future of this is going to be like you were talking about. We want this to sort of be like a company man type deal where, like, if someone gets hurt or if someone gets doxxed, we're there to step in and make sure that the blow doesn't hurt. Because, I mean, as we're registered, with being sort of a political fraternity nonprofit or as a fraternal nonprofit, our job is to provide benefits. And that kind of benefit is the sort of mutual aid, the, friendship and building communities. And so if someone does get fired, if they need a place to stay, let's find you a job or let's get you situated so that can happen quicker. And that's really what it was saying, we're not here just doing Pony Express Radio. We're not here just writing Substacks. I mean, it helps fund things, but you're here to meet like-minded people and to develop relationships that will be like the old fraternities of old. Because people say, like, oh, white people don't have ethnic fraternities or mafias like some groups do. Well, we did. They were called fraternities, and then Obama killed them. And so, and as someone who went to college during Obama's years with the whole Dear Colleague letter, none of the male fraternities that were on my college campus were allowed to get pledges because they were under, bans due to quote unquote hazing and other disciplinary action. So, because those are
Oh,
more or
is
less,
that radical? I never heard that story. That's interesting.
yeah, well, I mean, I didn't. I mean, I went to a state college. It wasn't as great as some other places, but yeah, I mean that happened for where I was at, and
Mhm.
so and I didn't. I got kicked out of the Young Republicans Club because I said gay marriage was gay, and so didn't help that the chairman was a huge queer, but still, it tells you how great things are on the college level. But
I got kicked out of the cake. I love
yeah, I
that.
got yeah
That's some cred there. I got kicked out of the college Republican Party for calling
for
gay marriage fake and gay.
yeah, sure did. But I mean that's what we talked about was is that these are our plans for the future. Is that no one's coming to save you. There's no based foreigner that's going to come out of here and own you. There's no, Castiza futurism or whatever. It's going to be what are you willing to build, and that this is what we're trying to do.
The big barrier here is so you've got like Basque weaving for the meetups. And the problem is that Basque weaving is growing, but I always want it to be way bigger than it actually is because we need to get the travel times down to get together groups. And if people have to drive a long while to do this stuff, the utility of the relationships they build are going to be weaker necessarily. So I like the steps that we're taking now to create kind of stronger organizations that are doing more things that are still local, and you have to make an effort to go out and do those things. But uh at the same time there's enough direction and aspiration there to make it worthwhile. And then hopefully as we do this, the on the ground organization like Basque Weaving can take the next step and bring more people into the fold and create local networks that are actually quite useful to what we're doing, and actually build real life relationships that, okay, you meet a person for Basque weaving or in Old Glory Club, you don't just meet him once a month for your Old Glory Club meeting or your Basque weave. You actually are working on him with several other projects. Your families know each other. You go to if you're my age, you go to each other's kids' birthday parties. If you're your age, maybe you get a beer after work. These are kind of the relationships we need to start fostering, because that's going to create the basis for local talent to come to the fore, and not just be sort of a speaking circuit for online personalities and online influencers. Although there has to be kind of a flow back and forth. There has to be a dance between those two forces at all levels.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's really going to be the challenge going forward. Again, the more in geographic proximity that these chapters continue to form in, I think the easier it will be for people to have those networks, connections, and friendships. Because again, we don't want this to just be you're here because Dave is here, or you're here because I'm
Yeah.
here, right? So those are the things.
Unfortunately, we are kind of stuck in that mode. For instance, it's very easy, not very easy. There are some pains in the ass putting together some of these larger events, but it's actually easier for me to put together a mini event. But it would be very, very difficult for somebody else to do the same thing, just because we had so many people who were making the drive out. And really, the problem isn't like I'm such a great speaker or such a draw that people will drive to hear me give a 20-minute speech. That's not the reason why I have the ability to put together. The reason why is that because of parasocialism, they trust me when I say I put together a panel of speakers, and it's going to be a nice event. Where if it's just a random person in a Discord server, right?
Sure.
There's not. It's harder to kind of make that trust connection. So as the networks grow, though, the power of people to be able to put together these events and sell tickets and or create, say, political movements, or all attend a city council, or do other aspirational actions will increase, because the reason why the influencers are necessary is because the network still isn't strong enough. But when the network is strong enough and on the ground enough, you will not need influencers to get these things off the ground. Even influencers as small as me, right?
Well, you have a larger platform than I do, Dave. So I mean, don't
Oh,
sell
I'm
yourself
sorry.
short.
I shouldn't say that. I was comparing myself to John Doyle. Okay, here,
Oh,
let's
there
go.
you go. There you go.
He's got like hundreds of thousands
That
of
is
people.
true. That's true.
Yeah. Anyway, I just realized that we were on your speech here. First thing I want to say, I'll let you pitch your own speech because I'll pitch mine.
Sure.
Man, I am in utter awe of your ability to speak extemporaneously and in an animated way. I have this problem where I write the speech, and I have kind of part of it that's a performance where I just talk more or less from my memory, the way you do. But the problems always come when I have to go from the paper to the performance. When I go from the performance back to the paper, I always have problems, and I always there's always little hiccups there. And you just gave an incredibly seamless speech stylistically about local governments, and I'm very much in admiration of that effort.
Well, I have these lovely pewter metal plates that say I'm really good at talking out of my ass from college and doing speech and debate in high school and college. And I guess it runs in my blood. Both my father and my grandfather and my great grandfather all had the gift of gab. And I have to turn it on like a light switch because I'm not a very social person. So it's like, oh, I got to go turn on the performance. So my speech given extemporaneously, as is tradition when I go to these conferences. I feel so bad for the Sildings people who did event books because they had to transcribe my impromptu nonsense. But so my speech was discussing about local politics and the ways that we look at power. Specifically, that we look at things in sort of this big abstraction of power in Washington when we don't consider localities. Orrin McIntyre likes to say he's a recovering journalist. I am unfortunately a bureaucrat by day job, and I work
Mhm,
in grants and economic development. So I talked mainly about my job in ways that wouldn't dox me, but I
mhm,
spoke about how your community is like academia. They are systematically not targeted because they don't hit these low to medium income or these impact scores for diversity or whatnot. And as someone who works in a majority white area, I have to fight tooth and nail to make it work for white business owners and for cities and towns that need it. And if you're trying to get out of the cities, you need to be talking to people who work in your council of government or your town's economic development officer, as well as your county commissioners, because these areas wield a lot of power and know the workarounds to some of these progressive bureaucratic barriers. And so, I was emphasizing political literacy, our relationship to the baby boomers, as well as don't feel so confident, perhaps, in your own form of political eschatology. No man knoweth the hour. Christ could come back like a thief in the night, as he says, but that it's important for us to realize, either it's Brazil or it's 1984, it's Fahrenheit 451, or it's Red Dawn, whatever it's going to be, you won't know until it happens. So in the meantime, we need to be seriously aware of our local affairs
Hmm.
because if not, we're going to be just like our boomer parents and or for me, my Gen X parents of yelling at the TV or yelling at the radio when we angrily quote tweet, uh, at the SPLC or some Washington Post journalist who just got laid off. Like we have our own ways of being boomers ourselves, and I think that the one benefit we have is that we're literate, politically speaking, and we could be more literate when it comes to local affairs and issues. So I was just saying that we should recontextualize our concepts of power, not throw away the big meta political stuff, but be aware of the fact that a lot of your problems have names and addresses and meetings that you can set up because most people who work in local government don't know you exist. And until you make yourself known to talk about things that matter, like schools or property taxes or bonds, things are going to go, status quo ante until you do something.
Yeah, 100%. And what we need to, and I have very, very little experience with local governments.
It's awful, but it's worth it.
I know there's got to be a way that we can kind of make our interactions with these institutions worthwhile from a time point of view and just from a purpose point of view. What are the weak points? What are the ways that people can grab the bags, so to speak? Because you're absolutely right. The way that the bureaucracy is hung together with, maybe that's a poor choice of words, with these metrics like impact scores, it sets up this ever never ending cash flow into our enemies' pockets. And if we could even have a tenth or 100th of that, the entire game would change so quickly, at least at a local level. And then from there on to greater things.
Well,
And
yeah,
the
yeah.
question is, how can you kind of dip your beak in that? How can you figure out a way to maybe pilot your own projects and direct things in a different direction?
Well, and some of the examples I gave in Q&A is that, there are tools that the left likes to use that actually are a double-edged sword. So anytime that, like, for instance, progressive NIMBYs, right, not in my backyard types, will fight something, they'll always go and deal with environmental issues because
Mhm.
everything that gets government money has to follow the National Environmental Policy Review Act of 1967. I deal with this all the time. I can't stand it because I live in the middle of America, so half the things inside that law don't really apply to my construction projects, like coastal barrier protection or whatever. But historical preservation societies are a great thing that A, the right can infiltrate, and B, are tools that you can use to cause sort of slow down for certain projects or destruction of historical buildings and monuments and such. But also that the simple fact that a lot of these things require quote unquote citizens participation. So, for instance, there are some grants like community block development grants or economic development administration grants that require a local citizens or local participation action committee, an LPAC committee, consisting of citizens and the local subject matter experts and the like. You could be on that committee. You could be part of those things. And the more that you understand how to navigate these systems as a layman, even better. Or if you want to be a contractor, if you're a business owner, if you're not registered with sam.gov and you don't have a UEI number to, win this award or win this contract where you're receiving taxpayer money,
Mhm.
you're gonna, that's something you're missing out on. Like I had lunch last Monday, not this Monday after the conference, but the Monday before, with people in my area from church that wanted to know more about what I do because it's like, well, if I can help you guys get money, and if your town ever gets hurt by a tornado or something, well, then hey, you are going to be the guy that they go to contract business to help rebuild everything. And that's a great thing if you own construction or a contracting company. And those are ways in which you can facilitate power in local fiefdoms that can hire, young white guys that want to get their hands into a trade or something, or guys that want to work in administration. And I think these are avenues of power that we kind of ignore because I get it. Some of us live in cities or some of us don't have time for this. And I understand that. But there is a lot of things out there that do wield power that we just never think about. Like, sure, the dog catcher doesn't matter all that much, but your county commissioner or your county attorney has a lot of power. And if you're in St. Louis, you should know that one of your county attorneys was recently held in contempt of court because she wasn't doing anything as a county judge. And what, yeah, she was a county judge, not a county attorney, but as a county judge, not doing anything because she was in nursing school trying to get a nursing degree while holding a job as a judge, an elected position. So
Hmm.
power is important to consider where you can. You always have to be politically realistic. That's always what I'm going to tell you. Work with the battlefield that you have. Don't, but dream big. Have an active imagination, but be aware of where you might be.
100%. Okay. Do you want to move on? Because we're coming up on 2 hours here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I actually traded my slot with Last Things because he had a flight that was early. And so the next one, one of my favorites was Last Things talk on the connection between Deleuze, the post-structuralist French philosopher who died, I think, in the early 90s, and was also influential on things like The Matrix. And the basically, well, first of all, he goes over sort of modes of resisting the technocratic society and modes of trying to break free from bounds. And this was the book I think he focused on was a collection or a summary of essays called Digital Nomads about or modern nomads. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was essentially the concept that groups of people are trying to experiment with different ways of counter signaling and signaling loyalty inside a system of control that is the modern world. And very much to my delight, he drew in one of my favorite board games of all time, Android Netrunner, and compared the various strategies to sort of the factions there. So Android Netrunner is a game about computer hackers fighting corporations. And it's very nice in that there's this cat and mouse dimension between parties that are fundamentally different. And this kind of mirrors the Deleuzian notion that in order to fight a war against the system, we kind of need to be adopting onto ourselves kind of fundamentally different perceptions about how we consider disagreeing and counter signaling and providing a new reality within the system. Do you have any comments on this one, Prudentialist? It's this was a great talk, but it was also one of the most theoretical of all the talks in
Oh,
this.
it just tickled me pink because I've read most of Deleuze's work, unfortunately,
Oh,
but
really? You have?
I know most of the postmodernists quite well. And although it is funny because out of all of the French, I guess post-structuralists, Deleuze is the one that's the most sane because he's married and had a family, whereas the rest of them are all just pederasts. And so we were just joking after there. We were just like, "Oh yes, I'm surrounded by faggots. Like something is wrong," and I don't. It's very entertaining in that respect. But no, I mean he talks about things about nomadology, the Deleuzian and
That's it.
Guattarian.
Nomadology.
But
Yes.
his book that he was focusing on was from Justin Murphy's Based Deleuze, which is a really good read. Although Justin Murphy's kind of weird, but I would recommend the book.
I can
Um,
never figure out that guy, to be honest.
I don't either. He's had some interesting interviews over the years, and I think he's working on or does work with an arranged marriage dating app, but whatever. The book is worth your time. But he was talking about how we used to be in the Marxist lens. We used to be a disciplinary society, and now we are a control society where we ourselves have to confess and publicly genuflect and say, I am free, despite the fact I'm not free. I'm actually under control. And that we are supposed to find a way to escape. And he focused on the three avenues Deleuze talks about, which is piracy, jamming, and viruses. Now, he wrote about a lot about this stuff in the early 90s, prior to his death, before the internet as we knew it became a thing. The older weapons of war for us don't really work with respects to worker strikes and mass protests because, we can easily create a situation where something's going to happen, like Charlottesville, or we can just immigrate a bunch of brown people to break up the worker strike. But we see how hostile control the control society exists with all things: human resources, remote work, DEI, language. Politics and power writ large has changed towards these explicit cybernetic instructions about webs of control. This is all things Deleuze writes about in, I think, 1993, shortly before his death. And the control society wants you to admit that you're free even though you're not. It doesn't care about you having children or family because that doesn't matter. You have to profess your liberation even though you're totally owned. And so piracy and jamming, culture jamming, linguistic jamming, war for words, piracy, death of the author. It doesn't matter that Helldivers has got a bunch of like gay race communist, PR people. The game looks fashy and it looks cool. And then viruses, this can be ideological viruses. This can be literal computer stuff if you want to go that far. But basically, Deleuze's idea is that we want to be so imperceptible to the regime that we cannot be controlled by the control society. This is why we are nomads. We can't exist inside the system. We must move around in our own little war bands that can jam things and be land pirates to the automated trucks that will inevitably deliver your gay Amazon goods. So for me, it was really enjoyable because I got to get theory hashed out to me, but also he made a fun reference at my co-host Gio of the Digital Archipelago, who sometimes will go on a rant where half the things he says don't make sense. And he says that is the imperceptibility that you want. You don't want people to understand you, only your in-group friends. And this goes back to the through line about language.
It's a through line to the language, but it's also a counter signal to the territorialization of the earlier talks. The earlier talks were all about how we needed to stay put. We can't go anywhere else. This is our place. But Deleuze is sort of a radical break from that. In his idea is we just have to kind of become even more frenetic, right? We have to become even more unterritorialized to kind of fight the system in a two-part mechanism. It's kind of funny because I'm currently in the process of reading a summary and kind of reading a abbreviation of Ibn Khaldun. And Ibn Khaldun, people might know him as the Arabic philosopher from the 15th century that developed the concept of asabiya, the sort of coherence, the will to live that collectives have. He was obsessed with the contrast between the nomadic and the civilized as different forces in sort of a civilizational cycle. Very much a prefiguration of Spengler, as far as I can tell. And I couldn't help but think that this dialectic was going on in between the various days of the Old Glory Club conference. The common thread of language being a form that we need to adopt as a mode of war. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. But then the question of how it's situated, extremely localized or extremely deterritorialized, or maybe a hybrid.
Yeah, there'll have to be some hybridization of the two. I think that we'll have to have an internal territorialization of ideas, cultures, religious practices, ethnic identity. But we're going to live in the most deterritorialized and deracinated landmass on Earth. And I mean, we've witnessed it in our lifetimes. It went from, remember the Alamo and 4th of July to Juneteenth is a federal holiday and Buc-ee's is more identifiable with HEB and Whataburger for Texas than Sam Houston and you can all go to hell and I'll go to Texas.
That is really great. And I guess in the interest of time, there's almost too much to say about Last Things talk. I don't even think he finished it all, to be honest. It was so jam-packed. But
yeah, he ran for time.
But it was certainly one of the densest talks and one of the ones that gave me the most ideas. But I'm not so sure any of them are going to be immediately resolvable. So any last thoughts on Last Things?
It was a great lecture, and I think that people should sincerely read Base Deleuze and consider that our models of politics from the 19th and 18th century don't apply to the 21st as much as we want them to, and we should consider some of the thinkers that we don't associate with the right in our conceptualization of politics and power and for the 21st century.
Yeah, 100%. And I also, I'm going to show my favorite board game, Android Netrunner. I've always thought that we could.
It's a great game. It is a great game.
It is a great game. And I always thought, I'm not saying that has to be Android Network, maybe people mentioning Twilight of the Imperium. It'd always be great if there was like one board game that everyone in the circle just got on board playing. And it was kind of a thing that would be universal, like you just dominated by our guys wherever it was played. uh if we could all agree to that and kind of come in, it would be kind of an interesting cultural experiment to try in a space like this. Because if the board game community was small enough, a community of our size could really make an impact. But I digress. All right, so second to last one before. Well, I don't know. Did you see Aaron McIntyre's
I
speech?
sure did.
So I saw this and I immediately regretted that trading spaces with last things, because I really wanted to go before this talk. And that is because Aaron McIntyre was pretty much the perfect kind of, here are the facts, here is the reality, and this is the capstone of the event. Like, this is everything in a nice little box. Here you go, which is what Aaron is good at. And unfortunately, I'm good at doing the exact opposite of kind of taking a small concept and blowing it up schizophrenically. And maybe you want to give the summary on this one, Prude.
So Oren McIntyre was up there with bullet points. I kind of feel like I need to contextualize it because he was there. He drove. I thought he was going to fly, but he drove because he had like 3 boxes of his book, The Total State, which you should
Mhm.
purchase. And he was giving away signed copies. I got mine that says "To my most restrained extremist." I thought that was nice. It's an inside joke he and I have as a guest on his show. But he was cribbing from his book a bit. But he was basically saying, "Here are the tools, and here are the stakes for how the total state rules over you." And here's what needs to be done to sort of counteract that on both an abstract, a concrete local political level, but also just creating actual organizations. We've spent years talking about parallelism. Here are the tools and means, i.e., like the Old Glory Club or what New Founding is doing in order to make that happen. And I mean, he outlined really, I think, sort of a good crowd pleasing speech in that we talked about nationalism, we talked about cultural, ethnic, racial and religious identities, which again are essential to any sort of right wing movement. And for people that give Oren shit for not being sufficiently right wing enough, I'm sorry. Like, Oren is going to be as optical as you can get for basically saying, well, the logical conclusion of war and nationalism is going to be based on racial and ethnic lines. But I mean, it was a talk that outlined, the whole, he this was everything ranging from Christianity to Julius Evola was mentioned to the ancient city and the American founding. It was this perfect sort of synthesis of, here's where we're at, here are the stakes, here's how you can build it, and here's how you can take the reins on a national level to move things in a rightward direction.
Yeah,
It was
and
it was the General Patton speech, really, is what it was like, but in a more concrete. I'm not blowing smoke up your ass, but here's actually how we can do something about it.
this is just the brass tacks of the matter. That is what his speech was, and it was a great summary of the events, and it probably should have been the last speech. I think that it would have been better if we put a My Impulse speech before that. Probably would have been better if we had gone earlier, but it was a really good speech. And I'm always also I don't exactly know how Aaron comes up with his talks. Does he have it just kind of memorized? Does he have it off of bullet points? I've considered doing that a few times before in the past, but I decided to write it out, and it's always a little hard to do that. So I've always wanted to ask Aaron how he comes up with his talks, but it was a great summary and a great statement of where we are politically and what needs to be the next step. And obviously, making an appearance was one of Aaron McIntyre's most cited books, The Ancient City by who wrote that? I'm Googling this right now. I'm actually in the middle of this, one of the many books that I'm it is
Numa Denis Fustel de Colan.
Descola. That's it. Yeah. Descola is the author of The Ancient City. And this contextualizes, this provides sort of a um backdrop for the Demastrian notion of constitutions being an expression of an implicit religious understanding of the world. And This is something that I think we always need to keep in mind when doing this is when we're building this area is we are human beings, and human beings are fundamentally territorialized. When we talk about concepts or principles that unify us, we can't entirely separate them from our territorial reality and our deeply situated way of living. And I don't know if anyone's really solved this problem about how we fight essentially this nomadic war and still maintain our rootedness. Me being more of a nomad, and then someone like George Bagby being someone more rooted. But this is the intellectual challenge of our time, and Arndt's right to highlight that. And the way he kind of brought it back to a very accessible but complete way of summarizing the modern challenge by the end of his speech was really quite admirable, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that it does. It's important to just consider that you are being heard. I know that that sounds strange, and I know that that the challenge is how do you remain rooted in the midst of all of this deracination and deterritorialization. But like I think that we'll have to work again where we're at, and I thought Oren did a very good job at tying these ancient historical, Christian and pre-Christian concepts all together to say like this is what America is, this is what America was, and here's how you can get some parts of the country, including yourself, to that state one day in the future, and hopefully sooner rather than later. And it was a very good in with that respect, and I think that for a guy that does 3 live shows every week and going off bullet points, I thought he did an excellent job
Yeah.
for his presentation style.
100%. I wish I'm going to try to train myself to learn more of that style for my own constrained schedule. But I guess that being said, we're coming to the last one that either of us has seen, which is mine.
I didn't
And
actually get to see yours, so you get to
yeah.
tell me all about it. I had
Well,
I had to
okay.
leave after Oren. I felt so bad because I even
No,
stayed
it's
longer than I had to, and then I'm driving home as fast as I can, trying to get back to where I am in the middle of nowhere, Texas, and I'm just like,
oh
man, I
no,
really should have taken Monday off.
I was doing the same thing, and we are going to have to just kind of imagine Paul Fahrenheit's speech, which was again really good. I'm sure it was really good, and I'm going to look at that on video as soon as I get it. Uh, Speaking for myself, my speech was titled "Our Divine Comedies," and it was about developing a spirit of comedy that we take to politics. No, largely, I think the edgy part of it was I the big icebreaker was a story about how I almost converted to Judaism as a young man, and was kind of warded off of that path in my life by one of my Jewish friends telling me a joke about sort of which I call the Yiddish chicken joke, which is about the futility of Jews converting to Christianity because there's something fundamentally separating them at a collective level, and how that kind of got me to ask questions about, wait a minute, there are implicit natures that peoples have and take with them that aren't just chosen. And which kind of caused me to my worldview as a liberal to kind of unravel and go in this more right-wing direction kind of inadvertently. um I think sort of the takeaway from the perspective I wanted to talk about was the utility that we have over our enemies is a certain connection to life, and a certain connection to optimism, and a certain connection to hope. Our enemies don't have the ability to really conceptualize happy endings or to tell stories with happy endings. This is something that I realized that this isn't actually part of my speech, but in the golden age of television, one of the reasons why the endings all suck is that they don't really have a way to get catharsis that seems serious in an ending and still have it be wholesome at the end. And so you have all these weird kind of, it either seems kind of brutally on the nose, or it seems that like politically speaking, or it's just kind of a giant clusterfuck where everything gets screwed up and reconfigured the way it ended in Game of Thrones, with no sense was made. and no actual thriving was occurring. And when you think about this challenge, when we talk about dissidents, we have to be fundamentally connected to the outcomes of people who exist inside of our community. And we have to be carriers of a great spirit of comedy. And by comedy, I don't mean like ha ha funny. I mean, as in Dante's Divine Comedy, sort of the spirit of great optimism and joy that lies behind everything, or the Shakespearean comedy as well. The feeling that when you get to the end, there's this relief and enlightening because you can see that you've entered into a larger world. So, I mean, take for instance the internet. How many people on the internet, from all the people we followed back in the day when everyone watched Channel Awesome, if you're a millennial, how many of those internet personalities had happy endings? Like none of them did. It's all kind of like a tale of personal. I mean, I guess PewDiePie, like that's the one. Then everyone else who had kind of reasonably happy endings were either right wingers or just kind of really grand exceptions. And other than that, the internet is this giant rabbit hole that seems to make people smaller. And where is that understanding that when we work together and watch each other, we're watching each other, our lives kind of develop and grow in blessings, again, losing some and gaining others. And then at the end of it all, there is this, we arrive at somewhere, right? Like your journey on the internet is not supposed to leave you as a person who consumes more product on the internet. Your journey on the internet is to locate specific things that improve your life and bring you into connection with people who will improve your life. In a home, in a moment of spiritual arrival. And it's that is the aspirational spirit that I want to be part of all our organizing efforts in the real world. And I think that if we can grasp that, we'll really have unlocked something powerful. Obviously, that kind of puts it in Machiavellian terms, but that's my little summary of the talk there, Prude. And I kind of, you can tell that I kind of took the same perspective on my live stream last night. But before I get self-conscious talking about myself, that was kind of the summary of it.
I'm just trying to imagine what Jewish Dave the Distributist would have been like. But no,
Well, I was never Jewish. It was like
oh, I
only a
know, I
thought.
know. That's just sort of what makes it all the more funny to me. It's just
Uh,
we'd be the one calling you cringe, and it'd be okay.
yeah,
But
exactly. All of the groypers would be right,
yeah, they sure would. They sure would. Um, then you would have never streamed with Nick Fuentes all those years ago.
Oh yeah. Wow, blast from the past. Yeah.
Blast from the past, yeah, because that came up one day on my like For You tab on YouTube, and I was like, when did Dave ever do this? And then I saw it was from like 8 years ago, and I was like, oh my god,
Good Lord, it's been a hot moment.
it's been a hot. You're a certified old head there, Dave.
Yeah.
But no, I think that that is the fundamental question. I think especially one for like you and I, ones people who have moved around a lot or have grown up and witnessed cultures from sort of afar.
Mhm.
I think it's kind of why I've always enjoyed your work, or sort of my
Oh, thank
screen
you.
name is partial homage to you. It's just that I've lived everywhere, and I have a deep appreciation for Western Europe and European and in English culture, especially the English, because that's most of my ancestry. I mean,
Yeah.
I was saying
We're all
this.
Anglophiles.
We really are, as Americans. We truly are. And I mean, even though my Christianity is not historically an American one, like the people I read in terms of the fathers are very much English and Celtic saints, because those are my people. I like to know how they received the gospel. That's why Saint Bede is one of my favorites. But in that respect, I think that it's there are things that deeply tie us to land and traditions and people. I mean, I I have no real relation to my extended family, but every family reunion I go to, or every Christmas I go to, I'm surrounded by people who are in overalls or work very blue collar kind of work, and I'm a bug man for all intents and purposes. I'm a bureaucrat and everything, but in your blood, those are your people. You can't do anything about
Mm.
that. You can't change that, and that is something that you have to contextualize in whatever you do. And so I think for us going forward, that rootedness and that anchoredness, we're in a weird spot because that's being so viscerally torn from us. But I think that as you say quite often, like the truth is on your side. It's not going to set you free in any literal sense, but it will set you free from those ideological bugman perversions of identity that thankfully we have somewhat an immune response to.
I'm totally blushing by those thoughts, Prude. I think we should go to super chats because
Yeah,
I think I will literally turn red if you keep on going on like this. I'm very flattered. I really want to say
that
my
isn't to kiss your
apologies.
ass. I'm just making a point.
I want to say a very sincere apology to Paul Fahrenheit, as I missed his speech and so did you. So we're going to have to not comment on this. All I can say is hearing the man speak, he was one of the most energetic speakers from the original I don't know what to call the conference, one of the original Tennessee conference speakers in 2021, and I have no doubt that he left he hit that podium like a bomb. So I'll
Yeah,
leave it at that. Yeah.
Paul is over 6 feet tall and is a military man, and that guy, and again, his speech in 22 with Francis Parker Yockey and being like the high status culture, the man can give you a speech that makes you feel like you're about to charge into battle and that you're not going to die.
Yeah.
He is a very good orator for being a very young man. And he's a great guy. When we first met him, he was kind of like a little but he's a married man, returned to Christianity, he's a father. And so I mean, like out of all the people who's had like the quickest turnaround from like sort of potential lolcow material to a guy who's got his shit together. Paul's a great example, and I
Yeah.
have an immense respect for him. Even though he's much younger than me, he's got his stuff together.
Well, I mean, he is a lion, and I always felt originally when I met him, like, you haven't decided whether you're a fox or a lion yet, right?
Yeah.
I think he's embraced his role as a lion,
Yes.
and I understand what my role is because my role as a fox, like foxes counter critique other foxes, but my role with Paul is just to kind of let him cook. We
Yeah.
exist in different ecosystems. Okay, guys, I can't display these on the screen, I don't think, but I appreciate you sending them in anyway. Yeah, if someone wants to super chat me, maybe I'll end with someone asked me about what is the Jewish chicken joke. I'll tell it if someone super chats me, and it would be a great way to end the stream. The joke that turned me away from Judaism. Son of Hester for $3 USA. Good to see you again, Jens. Can't listen live tonight, but I wanted to send my regards. Well, thank you very much, Son of Hester. No question, but thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to
Uh,
meet you again. And he and I got a photo together because he and I look
yeah.
very similar, except I have more of a hairline than he does. We have a great photo where we're both. I have a cigar in my mouth, and he's got
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
his pipe. So I mean, it was a really good
Oh,
time.
I know who you're talking about now. I
Yeah.
can never associate the faces I see at these conferences with the people, but now I know exactly who you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, this is going to be a challenge for us in the future. We are going to want to create events with photo ops, and how we manage that is going to be very contentious. So, if you're on the
You don't.
OGC leadership direction, I would be thinking about that right now
You
because
don't.
you don't?
Well, I mean, we made it very clear. Don't have your
Well,
phone
not at
or
this
any.
event,
Oh
no.
yeah, but I mean, in the future, things will change, and we'll
In
have
the
to
future,
concede
there's going to
that.
have to be a line we cross there,
Well,
I
yeah.
mean,
Well, I mean, the line has been crossed in some respects because the founding members of the org, our paperwork is out there legally on the
yeah.
founding charter document. If they wanted to come after, Pete or Paul or anyone else, like they could. But the point is to be prepared for when the day comes that when someone like Paul gets doxxed, it's more like Lomez, where nothing really
Yeah.
happens to him, than say any old head. Like my dream end goal one day for the OGC is that I think about our friend Millennial Woes who's been doxxed and could probably get a job in regular life ever again. I
Yeah.
want somewhere in the future where we give him like, I don't know, an old head sort of like pension package where it's like, listen, you were fundamental to my ideological development. I remember when you were still on YouTube. I don't know if you'll ever get like a regular life again, but like here's a little of what we can do just to say thank you. Like that's my dream, but
Yeah.
eventually you're right. We will have to cross that line, and we have had that conversation already.
Journeying from the Millennial Woes docs, which was devastating, to the Lomez docs, which was like swatting a fly. That's an amazing transformation. And obviously, I think it's harder to get doxxed in certain places than in others, and also in certain places of your life rather than others too, right? Because one of the things about you know, I think Millennials was caught a little optically off guard, and Lomas just wasn't. Lomas was ready to go out, like pulling a flex on the journalist who came after him, and that also made the docs a lot less potent. But I think just the times have changed a little bit too. The power of the docs is much less, at least in America, it is. Maybe in Europe, it still hurts. And when I think
Well,
about what happened to Laura
I
Towler and her
would
husband, right, that just
I
makes my
would
skin crawl.
caveat, however, that Lomez, I think, is the exception to the rule that proves the rule, because most of us are not well put together, well connected guys with the Claremont Institute or
Yeah,
have jobs as university professors. Most of us are average working stiffs with office jobs or whatever, or business owners. So
yeah,
I think
true.
that we should walk with some trepidation because
No, no,
Lomez
yeah,
is the dream if we get doxxed. But I also know that the likelihood of us being more like Christopher Sandbach or Patrick Casey or
yeah.
Millennial Woes is a better example of what most likely is to come for us still.
That
I think that's important to consider.
that is devastating. I totally agree. Perfect. Going on, Michael Castile for $3 USA. Hey Dave, how about a big donation? How big of a donation would you need to sponsor a Substack article about the 8 points from yesterday in more detail and why they must be so? Also, a belated Mary Ascension of the Lord to Prude. Yes. Is this
Yes,
Orthodox
today
Pentecost?
is yeah. Well, no, today is the Orthodox Ascension.
Oh, okay.
Pentecost is right around the corner. But yes, thank you.
Okay.
Christ has ascended.
Well, God be praised. The Orthodox and Catholic calendars always confuse me. So
It's okay. We get Pascha next year on the same day, so we'll at least be on stage for that for Lent.
okay, perfect. Yeah. Oh, so actually, Michael, I was considering doing a Substack article on the 8 points. It would be a shorter one, but I think I might just bang it out. That super chat definitely encourages me to spend my time on that rather than when you work a day job, you always have this queue, you know, and
Oh yeah.
it's like a queue of dirty dishes and it never ends. It's just like which one's gonna get the front burner, and if it doesn't get the front burner, it will never get cooked. And there's a variety of projects people keep on bothering me with. They've never gotten the front burner. Um, Ben White for $3 USA. Hello, good to see you again, Dave. I thought you fell off the face of the earth. Went to a young adults event at my church and met an old high school classmate of mine. Worth a 30-minute drive. Went to a young adults event at my church and met an old high school. Yes, this has been why. Oh,
Small
always the
world.
updates. Yeah. Well, there you go. Right. This is why you need to do things in real life. Yap and White. I mean, I very much enjoy seeing you on this during all my live streams. What's so funny is that I didn't really go anywhere. I've been pretty active on Twitter and writing regular Substack essays. It's just I haven't been posting to YouTube, and because of that, all the YouTube people think that I've fallen off the face of the earth for 2 months, when I haven't even really left online, and certainly not in real life. But thank you very much, Ben White. I'm sorry. Do you have anything to say?
Oh no, I'm just glad to see him. I know he usually has his romantic life update, but it's always good to hear that he's up and kicking.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've there are a lot of young men who are kind of coming to based ideas through just romantic woes. I'm thinking of Ho Math, which is a channel I've discovered, which is look, it's red pill stuff. So we've all heard it 10 gazillion times since 2012. Like it's the same points over and over again. I just love engineering diagram, and it's surprising the guy actually started repeating reactionary talking points where he's working through these like dating dynamic stuff that we've all heard a billion and a half times, right? So I mean,
Many
maybe
such
that's a
cases.
portal. Yeah, exactly. Maybe that's a portal to something that's more fulfilling. I don't know. It's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Bolero 393. I think John Doyle and DC Perspective really believe Trump will ride in on a white horse and save the day. I will buy them both a bottle of Louis the 13th if they're right, but I've been hurt
Oh,
before.
hurt before. Yeah, because I asked that at John's. I got the last question because everyone else was kind of like rah rah up about it, and I was like, "Hi, John. trust not in princes and the sons of men, but also, all these like other presidential campaigns were campaigning on all these things. They never happened. Needless to say, I've been hurt before. Why should I, buy into it? And, John had said at the Q&A, he was kind of staking his personal reputation on this. So yeah, they're a little more, though both DC perspective, David and John are a little more tuned into normie Republican electoral politics. They both work in electoral politics. So I guess that's their heuristic or blind spot.
All right, that's perfect. And look, everyone needs to have their own area, and electoral politics are not my area. And I'm glad that John Doyle is thinking about this stuff because I don't want to have anything to do with DC. I can tell you that right
Same.
now. But thank you very much, Bolero. Ben White again. How do you deal with temptation of lust while dating in modern culture? Most of the young women I meet lack modesty interests, although I think most of them don't mean ill. My Coomer days still haunt me, and I still remember previous images. Yeah, that's one thing is that I can say as a previous Coomer myself, this pornography is really harmful. It really kind of it's been more than a decade and a half, and it's still kind of like it still kind of echoes in your mind as a male. It's more harmful than we really give it credit for. I don't know. I think the best way to deal with lust is kind of exercise and sort of if you can learn how to focus and control your attention, then you can, I think, master sort of lustful thoughts. Do you have any advice, Prude?
There's this meme that was shared in Lambda's little Discord server. Luke Avery, one of my favorite sort of Christian people
Oh
on our
yeah,
little
I love
sphere.
Luke.
There was this someone posted this. He's like having like immoral sexual thoughts. Here's this graham cracker to calm you down. It's just a picture of a graham cracker. But I mean, jokes aside of that, for me, I would highly recommend the physical exercise part. One of the things, despite my more terrible past, to say the least, because I was into the red pill stuff when I was in college. But physical exercise works. I did SCA when I was in college, Society for Creative Anachronism, and
Uh,
getting your ass handed to you in metal armor by guys twice your size while you're trying to defend yourself is a great way to not think about those things. But also, um, anytime where if like you're at your desk and the temptation clicks you to hit the tab or whatever, just get up and take a walk. Take 5 minutes to walk away or get some physical exercise in. Do that. And then also, as both fathers of the church, both pre and post schism will tell you, also consider if you're hungry or not. Or like, are you really in the mood? Are you jonesing for some TNA because you want it, or is it because you're hungry? Like, satisfy other desires first. Not to say that you should be a glutton, but consider that there are sources of that you're sublimating as well. I mean,
mm.
it takes discipline, and I mean, the question that that my priest will always tell me is just like, so what do you mean? Like, we fall? Well, yeah, and then you get back up, and then what do you do afterwards? You do it for the rest of your life.
Mhm.
We get up and we fall. I mean, we're going to, but the thing about this stuff is that it's damaging, it's long term, and I'm kind of
Well,
glad that men and women are kind of coming to terms with, oh, this is
the
permanently
pornography
directed.
stuff is damaging. I
Oh
think that
yeah.
the stuff that's more kind of like what normally occurs to men, that just kind of fall your and pick yourself back up kind of deal, you
Well, I
know.
mean, pornography as well. You have to, try and delete it and keep it away from you and whatnot. I mean, I get young guys asking me questions all the time. Like I'm not to say I don't consume it or use it, but it's also that like anyone who's been around that stuff, and it's everywhere. I mean, even with how women
Mm.
dress and everything, like
Certainly on Twitter.
it's certainly on Twitter. Oh, Lord have mercy. I've cut my following on Twitter in half. And I know I've pissed a lot of people off that way. They're like, why'd you break mutuals? And I'm like, you horny post too much. I've left group chats over blasphemy and people just posting that sort of stuff. Like if you see it, just as Christ says on the Sermon on the Mount, just cut it off. Better to be cut off from it than to have it all burn in hell. So I mean, just go with that. Just cut it out.
Well said. Okay, so this is the super chat that I suggested, and that will end the stream because I don't see any more. Tell me, do you have anything else to say about the Old Glory Club conference before we close, Prude? Because this will be the last super chat I answer. They
Sure.
want me to tell the joke.
Absolutely. So if you didn't get a chance to go, your loss. Got to meet a lot of great people, a lot of followers, and people who have super chatted tonight. We will be doing it again next year.
Mhm.
Be on the lookout for chapters forming near you. And additionally, that even if you're not interested in what the OGC has to offer, Dave's suggestion about basket weaving is
Mm.
important. And seriously consider what you can do in your own area, because until you start participating locally, you will never know who is out there who shares a similar belief. Because even if they don't follow right wing Twitter, even if they don't follow YouTube or whatever, a lot of people in your area have come to similar reactionary conclusions on their own that didn't require, 500 hours of e-drama and lore about mold bug or whatever to get them there. And so
Yeah.
I would behoove you, all of you listening, within reason, I mean, especially if you live overseas, do what you can to meet others around you that have a similar like mind. Because the biggest problem with atomization, mainly due to immigration, is that you're gonna feel like there's no one out there, but you are not alone.
Well said. And I will also say that basket weaving, there are many organizations, not just the OGC, that build off of basket weaving. So if you are interested in the Beowulf Foundation or any of the other groups associated with shieldings, that is also an option for you. And as a matter of fact, those groups might be stronger in your region, especially if you're in Europe, because the OGC is only American, or in Canada. So there's that to consider too. Well said. And I think I've pretty much said everything about the conference that I can say tonight before I close. So with your permission, Prude, I will close by telling the Yiddish chicken joke.
I'm so excited. Let's go.
It's not that good of a joke, but this is the joke that changed my life, because in junior high, I was considering converting to Judaism just to get the identity. And when I brought up the topic of conversion, not specifying that I might be interested in converting to Judaism, what my Jewish friend assumed was I was trying to convert him to Christianity, even though I was essentially an atheist at the time, but I was culturally Christian, right? And so he tells me this joke, and this joke takes place in a tenement building in New York in the early 20th century. And in this tenement building, it's occupied mostly by families of Polish people, and they're Catholic, of course. And there's one Jewish widower who's still there after his wife died, and the rest of his community moved to a different neighborhood in New York. And he doesn't want to move because he's got too much sentimental attachment to the place where he had his family with his wife. But every Friday, because the Poles are Catholic, they have meatless Fridays, and they have to subsist on this very unappetizing fish soup. Whereas the Jewish man, he's celebrating Sabbat dinner, and he has a huge sumptuous baked chicken that now he bakes up in all this oil, and it just coats the entire apartment complex in this smell of chicken that makes the Poles very, very jealous. So at once they decide that to not be tempted, their best course of action is to convert this guy imminently to Catholicism, so that he will have to eat fish on Fridays and they won't be tempted by the smell of chicken. So they waylay him one day, this old guy, and they say, "Oh, you should really convert to Catholicism." The Jewish guy says, "Oh, I don't know anything about Christianity. What am I supposed to believe?" And the Poles know absolutely nothing about theology, even though they observe the fasts. And that's how you know that this is from the early 20th century. They say, "Oh, no, don't worry about believing things. It's just a simple process. We'll take you to the church. You'll talk to the priest, and he'll do the ceremony. You're a Jew. You were born a Jew. You're a Jew all your life, but we'll do the ceremony and pour the water over you, and then you'll be Catholic." And the Jew says, "Okay, I guess that's not so hard." And so he goes to the church, and sure enough, the ceremony goes on. You're a Jew. You're born a Jew. You're a Jew all your life, but with this water, you are now Catholic. And okay, fair enough. And they break up for the day, and the Poles remind the Jewish guy, "Okay, that means you can't eat chicken on Friday anymore. You have to eat fish. It's meatless Fridays. You got that?" And the Polish man's like, "Yes, I understand the rules of Catholicism, at least that one." And so they go off, but then the next Friday occurs, and everyone in the apartment complex smells chicken coming from the apartment of the old, formerly Jewish man. And of course, the Poles are furious. It's been less than a week, and the guy's already apostatized. So the next Friday, they're like, "Okay, we got to catch this guy in the act. We're going to camp out of his apartment and spy on him and see what he's doing, see if he's actually breaking the meatless Fridays." And so they're camping out and spying in through his window. And sure enough, Friday dinner comes along, and they see the Jewish guy come into his kitchen carrying a pan and an uncooked chicken. But before he puts it in the oven, they're watching him, and they watch him take the chicken to the sink, and he holds the chicken up with a very, very devout look in his eye, and he has a glass of water in the other hand, and he starts speaking to the chicken. He says, "Chicken, you're a chicken. You were born a chicken. You were a chicken all your life. When I pour this water over you, you will become a fish." And yeah, the futility of trying to change something about yourself that is unchangeable. Many things can be territorialized or deterritorialized, but it takes more than a ceremony to change your people. Even though I don't think I want to blaspheme the act of baptism that much, but that's the joke. All right, guys. So with that, I'd like to thank Mr. Prudentialist and everyone else for joining me. And I will hopefully see you all at events. If not that, then on our live streams or on Substack. Have a great night.
Thanks so much for having me on.